They told me my boat was making too many ripples, but what they didn't know was that I owned the entire lake beneath it, and the very water they claimed to control was mine to the last drop, which made their arrogance not just laughable but also dangerous because they had no idea the storm they were about to stir. It started on a bright Saturday morning, when I had taken my old but well-kept fishing boat out to the center of Blue Heron Lake, letting the soft hum of the motor break the otherwise still water, a place I considered my personal sanctuary since I had bought the lake and the surrounding acreage years before as part of an investment and a promise to my late father, who had always dreamed of owning a piece of water where no one could tell us how to live, fish, or boat, and yet here I was, a property owner with the deed framed on my study wall, being yelled at across the water by a woman in designer sunglasses, standing on the HOA community dock, waving her hands like she was summoning a storm, her voice carrying with that sharp, nasal tone of authority that only came from people who had never actually had any. And as I cut the motor to hear her better, she shouted that my boat was creating ripples too close to their community swimming zone, and that I was in violation of HOA water regulations, which made me laugh so loudly that even the ducks scattered off the shoreline, because the absurdity of someone trying to enforce swimming rules on water they didn't own was so rich it could have been bottled and sold. I shouted back that I wasn't in their swimming zone, that there was no such thing legally speaking, and that I had every right to be exactly where I was, but she huffed, pulled a phone from her pocket, and shouted she was calling the board. Immediately, as if the HOA board carried more weight than the county clerk's office where my ownership papers were filed in ink and sealed by the registrar. And that was the moment I knew this was not just an irritating encounter, but the beginning of something larger, because HOAs don't stop at one complaint. They escalate, they scheme, they write letters, they fine, they rally neighbors into mobs of conformity, and when they don't get their way, they lie, cheat, and intimidate. And I had already seen enough of them in other places to know they were coming for me like hornets after someone kicked their nest. But what they didn't know was that this time they were building their hive on my branch, and I had no intention of being stung. The first official letter came 2 days later, slid into my mailbox in an envelope with that bland yet menacing HOA letterhead, informing me that unauthorized boating activity had been observed on the community lake and that I was required to remove my boat permanently within 7 days or face escalating fines, which I read with a smirk while sipping coffee on my porch overlooking the same lake, the morning sun turning the water gold, the very view that reminded me of why I had bought the land in the first place. And I folded the letter neatly, walked inside, retrieved the deed, and placed them side by side, laughing at how they had just threatened the legal owner of the water with trespassing, which was about as foolish as telling a rancher he couldn't graze his own cattle because someone else didn't like the sound of cowbells. I decided not to respond immediately because silence, I've learned, is sometimes the sharpest blade. And sure enough, 3 days later came the second letter, this one with red ink across the top screaming, "Final warning," threatening fines of $500 a day if my offending boat remained in the water, and they even had the gall to attach a blurry photograph of me, taken from across the lake with what looked like a neighbor's zoom lens, circled in red like I was some criminal suspect. And that was the moment I decided to stop playing defense and go on the attack, because if they wanted a war over ripples, then I would give them a tidal wave. The next morning, I called my lawyer, an old friend named Martin, who had helped me through the property acquisition years earlier, and when I told him the HOA was trying to fine me for boating on my own lake, he laughed so hard I thought he might choke. Then he cleared his throat and said, "Let them write as many letters as they want, because every one of them is another nail in their coffin." And that gave me more satisfaction than I can describe, because it wasn't just about the boat anymore. It was about principle, about drawing a line in the sand, or in this case the shoreline, and making it crystal clear that I wasn't some pushover neighbor who could be bullied with empty threats and faux authority. But the HOA wasn't done. No, They escalated as I knew they would, and that Saturday they staged what I can only describe as a parade of pettiness, with 5 board members marching down to the dock in matching polo shirts embroidered with their HOA crest, clipboards in hand, looking like a discount security team, and they stood there, shouting across the water again, telling me I was in violation of community harmony codes, and that if I didn't comply, they would tow my boat out themselves, which made me put down my fishing rod, stand up, and let my voice boom back across the lake, telling them that not only did I own the lake, but that every foot of water they were standing over was private, property under my name, and if they dared set foot in so much as a canoe without my permission, they'd be trespassing, punishable by law, which made them pause for the briefest second before one of them, a red-faced man with a paunch straining his belt, yelled back that I was bluffing, that the lake was community-owned, and that their lawyers would prove it in court, which was the moment I knew this was going to turn into a full-blown legal war, because nothing enrages an HOA more than discovering they have less power than they imagined, and nothing delights me more than watching tyrants crumble under the weight of their own ignorance. Over the next 2 weeks, the battle intensified, with letters escalating into fines, fines escalating into threats, and threats escalating into outright lies circulated in their neighborhood newsletter, where they painted me as some outsider, intruder destroying their peaceful community with reckless boating, while conveniently ignoring the fact that the very lake attracting their property values was mine to the shoreline, and all their glossy brochures when they bought their homes conveniently forgot to mention that small legal fact, because the developer had leased water access but never transferred ownership, something I had quietly snapped up years ago when no one else paid attention, a decision that now turned out to be the sharpest card in my deck. I waited. Let them dig deeper. Let them distribute their lies, because every falsehood, every fabricated fine, every harassing letter was another piece of evidence. And then, when the stack was high enough, Martin and I walked into the county courthouse with a folder thicker than a phone book, dropped it on the clerk's desk, and filed a lawsuit for harassment, defamation, and unlawful trespass, attaching not only their letters but also aerial maps, deed records, and photographs of their members crossing into my water without permission, fishing, swimming, and boating over territory they didn't own, each instance a legal trespass now carrying potential fines, and when the summons landed in their HOA president's manicured hand, I'm told her face drained of color like someone had pulled the plug on her entire ego. But before the first hearing could even be scheduled, they tried one last desperate move, staging a community vote to declare the lake theirs, as if neighborhood ballots could override county deeds, which only made them look more ridiculous when the local news picked up the story and ran with the headline, "HOA declares ownership of lake they don't own," splashing their arrogance across the evening broadcast, and that, right there, was the turning point. Because public humiliation is a poison HOA boards can never swallow, and while they were busy scrambling to repair their image, I was quietly preparing the next move. Because my goal wasn't just to stop their harassment, it was to make an example of them, to fine them for every illegal step they took on my water, and to teach them once and for all that you don't pick a fight with someone who holds the deed to the very ground, or in this case, the very lake, you're standing on. They thought filing countersuits and spreading lies would drown me, but they didn't realize I was the one controlling the current. Because while the HOA president and her smug board members strutted around the neighborhood, boasting about how they were going to take back the lake with their lawyers, I was quietly setting up the kind of legal trap that would not only crush their arguments, but also make them pay for every ripple they had ever dared to complain about. And the beauty of it was that they didn't even see it coming, because tyrants rarely look down to check if the ground is crumbling under their feet. They only keep staring at the throne they think they deserve. The first real blow landed when Martin, my lawyer, filed a preliminary injunction that froze every one of their so-called fines until ownership of the lake was legally clarified, which might sound like a small step, but it was like cutting the head off their snake. Because without the power to enforce fines, the HOA suddenly looked toothless to its own members, and whispers started spreading in the neighborhood that maybe, just maybe, the board had bitten off more than it could chew. And that kind of doubt spreads fast in tight communities where property values are king. But the president, a woman named Meredith, whose wardrobe seemed permanently stuck on golf course chic, doubled down instead of backing off, calling an emergency board meeting where she rallied her most loyal followers, declaring me a squatter on community resources and vowing to bankrupt me with legal fees until I surrendered, which made me laugh, because she was unknowingly promising to drown herself in the very lake she was trying to steal, and the best part was that I didn't even need to spend much, because every motion they filed, every frivolous claim they made, was tossed out like garbage once the judge saw the deed with my name on it. But Meredith wasn't one to quit, and that's when things turned ugly outside the courtroom, because HOA boards, when desperate, resort to intimidation, and soon I started noticing cars slowing down in front of my house late at night. Anonymous. Letters slipped under my door accusing me of ruining the neighborhood, and even one morning where I found a dead fish tossed onto my porch with a note that said, "You don't belong here," which only confirmed I was winning, because when your enemy leaves the battlefield of law and resorts to petty fear tactics, it means they're already losing the war. But still, I documented everything, snapped photographs, saved every letter, recorded every suspicious incident, because I knew the day would come when that evidence would sink them even deeper, like anchors tied around their ankles. Meanwhile, I played my part in the shadows, sending polite notices through Martin to every single board member reminding them of the legal definition of trespass, attaching photos of their children swimming in my lake without permission, of their husbands fishing off my shoreline, of their paddle boats cutting across my water, and in those letters we included the potential daily fines I was entitled to charge under county statute, $750 per instance, per day, which multiplied across weeks and across dozens of families, added up to numbers so high they could have bought another lake, and the beauty was they had no way out, because every cannonball dive, every fishing pole, every inflatable swan drifting across my water without consent was another line item on the invoice I was preparing. And slowly, word began to spread among the less loyal neighbors that Meredith's crusade was about to cost them personally, and you could see the shift happening in real time, their smiles tightening when they saw me, their whispers growing sharper when they walked past the board meetings, because loyalty always dries up when it hits the wallet, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks turned into fractures. But Meredith, blind with pride, tried one more public stunt, organizing what she called a Lake Reclamation Day, where half the neighborhood showed up at the dock with kayaks, paddleboards, and floats, blasting music and cheering as if they had taken back territory from an invading army, and I stood on my porch with my camera, recording the entire circus, smiling as I captured hours of evidence of trespass. Every splash another dollar, every cheer another nail in her coffin. Because sometimes the best revenge is just letting your enemy build their own gallows, and build it she did. With streamers and banners and even a local newspaper photographer she invited to cover their so-called victory. And when the article ran the next day with a front-page photo of dozens of residents celebrating their lake, it was like a gift wrapped in ribbon, because I simply clipped the article, added it to my ever-thickening case file, and waited. The court hearing finally came, a warm Thursday morning when both sides marched into the courthouse, Meredith wearing a smug smile like she'd already won, flanked by 2 lawyers the HOA had hired with community funds, while I sat calmly beside Martin, who had a stack of documents so tall it looked like a tower of justice. And when the judge entered, silence fell, and the first thing Martin did was lay down the deed, the county registrar's seal shining under the fluorescent lights, followed. by tax receipts showing years of payments made in my name, and maps showing clear ownership boundaries, all of which took less than 10 minutes to present. And then the judge turned to Meredith's lawyers and asked quite simply, "Do you have anything to dispute the deed?" And they shuffled papers, muttered excuses, and tried to argue about community use and historical precedent. But the judge cut them off with the kind of sharpness that leaves no room for debate, reminding them that precedent does not override recorded ownership, and use does not equal ownership. And at that moment, the smug smile slid right off Meredith's face like mud in the rain. But the best part wasn't the judge affirming my ownership. I already knew that was ironclad. The best part was when Martin brought out the second folder, the one filled with photographs, letters, recordings, and the tally of trespass. Fines that had accumulated over months, neatly itemized with dates, times, and statutory penalties, and as he read the total aloud, a number in the 6 figures, the courtroom gasped, and Meredith's face went pale, and I leaned back in my chair, savoring the silence that followed, because there is no sweeter sound than the moment arrogance realizes it has been defeated. The judge, to his credit, didn't grant the full 6 figures right away, but he did rule that the HOA had engaged in unlawful harassment, had no authority over the lake, and that damages and fines would be considered in a follow-up hearing, which meant the door was wide open for me to keep pressing. And that ruling alone sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, because suddenly Meredith's empire looked like a house built on sand, and every homeowner realized they might be on the hook for her hubris. That night, I sat on my porch again, this time with a glass of bourbon, watching the sunset paint the lake in fire, and I could see across the water the silhouettes of neighbors gathered in tense huddles, their laughter gone, their voices low. And I knew they were finally asking themselves the question that should have been asked from the start. Why pick a fight with the man who owns the very water they drink in, swim in, and profit from in property value? And the truth is, the answer was simple. Pride, greed, and a woman named Meredith who believed her board crest gave her the power of a crown. But crowns are heavy things, and when they slip, they take the whole head with them. Still, I wasn't satisfied yet, because winning in court was one thing, but teaching a lesson that would echo for years was another. And as I finished my drink and set the glass down, I decided that Section 3 of this war, the real punishment, was about to begin, and this time I wouldn't just defend my rights, I would make the HOA pay, literally, until they wished they had never heard the word ripple again. They thought the worst was over after the judge confirmed my ownership, but what they didn't understand was that I had only just begun sharpening the blade, because winning the deed battle was one thing, but collecting damages and pressing trespass claims was another beast entirely. And while Meredith walked out of that courthouse pale-faced and trembling, clutching her purse like it could protect her from the storm she had summoned, I walked out calm, collected, and already 3 steps ahead, because my plan wasn't just to defend my rights anymore, it was to dismantle her HOA brick by brick, until even the memory of their arrogance sank beneath the waves of my lake. The first strike came in the form of certified letters, hand-delivered by the county sheriff, each one addressed to a different HOA board member, each one carrying an invoice for trespass fines that tallied weeks of unlawful use. And the numbers weren't small. We're talking thousands upon thousands per household. And when those letters landed in their mailboxes, the panic spread faster than algae on still water, because it was one thing to cheer Meredith on when the fight was theoretical, but quite another to see your own bank account threatened by her ego, and soon enough, neighbors who had once waved proudly from the dock were avoiding her house like it was cursed. But I didn't stop with the board, no. I made sure every resident who had dipped a toe into my lake without permission received notice, complete with time-stamped photographs of their kids splashing, their husbands casting fishing lines, their floaties drifting across the water, each image undeniable proof that they had trespassed. And the fear in their eyes when they realized I had documented everything was delicious, because they knew there was no escape. And while many tried to play innocent, claiming they didn't know the lake wasn't theirs. Ignorance isn't a shield in court, and Martin made sure they understood that clearly when he followed up each letter with a legal citation printed in bold. Meanwhile, Meredith tried to rally what was left of her loyalists, calling emergency HOA meetings, screaming about how I was extorting them. But her voice had lost its power, because the same people who once hung on her every word were now glaring at her as the reason they might lose their savings. And slowly but surely, whispers of a recall started floating through the neighborhood, whispers Meredith couldn't stamp out no matter how many glossy newsletters she mailed. Then came the second court hearing, where Martin laid out the trespass fines in meticulous detail, presenting not just numbers, but stories, showing the judge photographs of late-night parties at the dock with beer cans floating in my water, of fishing contests held on weekends, of paddle boats tied illegally to my shoreline trees, and with each image, the HOA looked less like a governing body and more like a gang of freeloaders leeching off property they didn't own, and by the time Martin finished, even the judge seemed irritated by their audacity, finally granting me damages and ordering the HOA to pay not only legal fees, but also a hefty sum for repeated harassment, a ruling that sent Meredith into a silent rage, her face locked in that mask of false composure that cracked the moment she stepped outside, where reporters were waiting, hungry for quotes, and she snapped, yelling about unfair courts and outsider corruption, which only made her look more unhinged on the evening news, and I sat back that night with a grin, sipping another glass of bourbon as the anchor replayed her meltdown over and over. But even that wasn't enough for me because humiliation fades, but financial pain lingers, so I pushed harder, filing liens against the HOA's communal funds, freezing their budget, choking off their ability to repair fences, mow lawns, or even keep their streetlights lit. And soon the pristine neighborhood they had prided themselves on began to show cracks, weeds sprouting high, paint peeling, roads left unrepaired. And the very residents who had once cheered Meredith now cursed her name, blaming her for every pothole and every dark street corner. And when Halloween rolled around that year, not a single child trick-or-treated on her block because the entire community had turned its back on her. Still, she fought on, too stubborn to admit defeat, trying one last desperate maneuver by hiring a PR firm to spin the narrative, sending out glossy pamphlets accusing me of targeting families and weaponizing property law. But her spin fell flat when Martin and I responded with a public notice posted at the county clerk's office and mailed to every resident, outlining the true ownership, the court rulings, and the exact fines levied, backed by legal citations and official stamps, leaving no room for lies. And when the truth stares you in the face in black and white, no amount of glossy pamphlets can erase it. Neighbors started calling me directly then, not to fight, but to apologize, to beg for leniency, some even offering to pay small settlements quietly just to avoid more court drama, and while I accepted a few, reducing their fines if they swore never to trespass again, I made sure Meredith got no such mercy, because the queenpin of arrogance deserved to feel every ounce of the weight she had thrown at me, and the day I watched the sheriff's deputy tape a foreclosure notice to her door was the day I knew I had not only won, but obliterated her, because without her house, she had no foothold. Without her title, she had no power, and without her pride, she had nothing left to wield. But I wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. No. My goal was always justice, always to prove that you cannot bully the rightful owner of land and water just because you wear a polo shirt with a crest. And in the end, that lesson echoed louder than any court ruling, because as Meredith slunk out of the neighborhood, suitcases stuffed into a dented SUV, the rest of the board dissolved. The HOA collapsed under lawsuits and debts. And the very lake that had sparked this war shimmered quietly under the setting sun, mine alone once again, undisturbed except for the gentle ripples of my boat cutting across its surface, the same ripples that had started this battle and ended up drowning my enemies in their own arrogance. They thought stripping their president of her house and bankrupting their HOA was the end of my campaign. But in truth, that was only the clearing of the battlefield, because now I had the chance to reshape everything around the lake on my terms. And the real beauty of owning water is that everyone needs it, but only one person controls it, and that person was me. So while the neighborhood reeled from Meredith's downfall, with lawns overgrown, fences sagging, and property values sinking faster than stones in the shallows, I was already drafting my next move. A set of permits filed with the county to formally register the lake as a recreational enterprise under my management, which meant I could legally charge fees for access, boat launches, fishing rights, and even swimming zones. And when the county stamped it approved, I posted notices at every trailhead, dock, and access point. Private lake. Permission required. Trespassers will be fined. Bold letters that turned once proud residents into petitioners knocking at my door, and oh, how the tides had turned, because the same neighbors who had once cheered Meredith's rants now came hat in hand, asking politely how they might arrange access, their voices dripping with forced humility, and I listened, leaning back in my chair, sipping my coffee, pretending to consider while I already knew the answer. They could have access, sure, but it wouldn't be free anymore. It would come at a price, monthly permits priced like gym. Memberships, daily passes for guests, fishing licenses for their weekend hobbies, and every penny of it flowing into my pocket, a reversal so complete it felt biblical, like pharaohs drowning in the sea they once claimed to control. Some tried to resist, of course, clinging to the ghost of their HOA, muttering about rights and traditions, but without Meredith, their voice had no edge, and when they tested me by sneaking onto the water anyway, I simply called the sheriff, handed over the trespass orders already filed in court, and watched as law enforcement escorted them off my shoreline like children caught stealing candy. And when word of those arrests spread, compliance followed quickly, because no one wants to be the neighbor with a mugshot in the local paper for stealing a swim. Meanwhile, I invested in improvements, not for them, but for me. A brand new dock built stronger than the HOA's crumbling one, a boathouse with cedar siding gleaming in the sun, even solar-powered lamps along my private stretch of shore, turning my property into the shining jewel of the lake while the rest of the neighborhood languished in disrepair, and the contrast was delicious because every time they looked across the water, they saw what power and ownership looked like, and what failure and arrogance had left them with. But I wasn't done yet, because true victory isn't just financial, it's psychological, and so I hosted events on my land. A summer barbecue open to friends from outside the neighborhood, live music echoing across the water, laughter, and boats drifting where I allowed them, while the residents watched from their darkened porches, trapped by their own stubborn pride, and nothing broke them faster than realizing the lake that had once been their pride and selling point was now my stage, my kingdom, and they were nothing but spectators. Still, I had no desire to keep enemies forever. And once the humiliation had sunk deep enough, once they had tasted what it meant to live without power, I extended an olive branch, of sorts, offering them discounted access if they signed, agreements acknowledging my sole ownership and renouncing any future claims, documents drafted so tightly by Martin that not even a hair could slip through, and one by one they signed, swallowing their pride, turning their HOA dream into my deed-fortified empire, until finally the last holdout came knocking, a retired man named Wallace who had once yelled at me from the dock with Meredith, now standing sheepishly with his cap in his hands, asking if he could buy an annual pass for his grandchildren, and in that moment I felt the full weight of the journey, from the day they screamed about ripples to the day they begged for access, and I realized I had not just defended my rights, I had rewritten the balance of power in the entire neighborhood. But the cherry on top came months later, when real estate agents began advertising the homes around the lake again, forced to list lake access available by private permit only in their brochures, which made values drop and buyers hesitate. And soon those same homeowners who once tried to fine me were begging me to purchase their properties at reduced prices. And I did, slowly but surely, piece by piece, until the houses that once gave the HOA its strength now gave me rental income. And the community that once tried to bury me under rules and fines was now mine in every sense of the word. Financially, legally, and symbolically. And as I walked the shoreline at sunset, the water glowing with firelight reflections, my boat rocking gently at the dock, I thought back to Meredith screaming about ripples and realized she had been right about one thing. Ripples do spread. Only she never imagined the ones she complained about would turn into waves big enough to drown her entire board and wash their kingdom into my hands forever. They thought surrendering access rights and selling off their homes marked the end of the battle. But they didn't realize that for me, the lake was never the finish line. It was only the launch pad. Because once you learn how fragile power really is, how quickly a group of self-appointed rulers can collapse when faced with true ownership and law, you begin to see every other opportunity around you not as a wall but as a door waiting to be opened. And that's exactly what I saw as I stood. On my dock one crisp autumn morning, mist curling off the lake like smoke from a victory fire, coffee steaming in my hand, while behind me on the hill stood 3 houses I had bought from desperate HOA deserters, now rented out to tenants who paid me not only for their roofs, but also for the privilege of using the water that glistened below, which meant I had effectively transformed the community into my own private estate without ever lifting a hammer or pouring a foundation. And as more families moved out, unable to stomach the shame of living in a neighborhood whose HOA had collapsed in scandal, I moved in buyers of my choosing, veterans, teachers, hardworking families who had no interest in dictating to others, but who respected the rules I set forth, rules rooted in law and fairness rather than vanity and greed. And slowly, the neighborhood's culture shifted. The old guard of clipboard tyrants replaced by decent folk who paid their permits happily, fished respectfully, and treated the lake with reverence instead of entitlement, which was victory enough for some men, but not for me. Because Meredith and her cronies had ignited something deeper in me, a fire that whispered, this wasn't just about one lake, it was about the principle of dismantling false power wherever it pretends to exist. And so I expanded, scanning county records like a hawk for other forgotten parcels, old waterways, neglected commons where HOAs strutted around, like kings without crowns, and sure enough I found them. A creek upstream nobody realized had a separate deed. A stretch of forest behind the subdivision long assumed to be community green space, all of which I acquired quietly through tax auctions and legal channels, until one day the same neighbors who once lectured me about community harmony realized the walking trails behind their yards now belonged to me too, and if they wanted to set foot there, they'd need permission just like they did for the lake. And oh, the look in their eyes when they saw new signs posted. Private land, access by permit, was sweeter than any bourbon because it cemented the reality that their reign of petty tyranny was over forever and mine had just begun. Still, I wasn't cruel. I offered them fair rates, community discounts, even family passes, and many took them gladly, grateful someone competent now managed the land. But I always made sure the memory of Meredith's folly lingered, because forgetting would mean repeating, and I wasn't about to let that happen again. Speaking of Meredith, the last I heard she was living 2 counties over in a rented townhouse, stripped of her title, her fortune drained by legal fees, her reputation shredded by news clips replaying her courtroom meltdown. And sometimes, late at night when I saw the moonlight ripple across my lake, I wondered if she thought about me, about the empire she tried to control and ended up handing me on a silver platter. And though I rarely wasted energy on pity, I did feel a twinge of satisfaction knowing her downfall would echo like a cautionary tale to every other would-be HOA tyrant who thought they could bully their way into ownership. But the true finale came the day a developer approached me, sleek suit, polished shoes, eager smile, offering to buy the entire lake and surrounding land for a figure so large it made my head spin. But I turned him down without a second thought. Because what price could you put on justice, on legacy, on the satisfaction of knowing that the place my father once dreamed of owning, the place I defended against an army of arrogant board members, was mine forever and always, untouchable and unquestioned, a fortress of freedom surrounded by water, and besides, the money was already flowing in, from permits, rentals, and new ventures like guided fishing tours I launched with veterans, from town, creating jobs, community, and income, all from the ripples they once told me were a nuisance, proving once and for all that their complaint was my crown, their hatred my fuel, their downfall my inheritance. And so, as I stand here now, years later, watching the sun dip below the horizon, waves whispering against the dock, neighbors grilling on porches they rent from me, children laughing as they swim in the zones I've marked safe, I smile at the irony that all of it, every last victory, every ounce of power, came from one arrogant demand to move my boat for making ripples, because they were right in a way. I did make ripples. Only mine spread farther than they could. Ever imagine ripples that became waves, waves that sank an entire HOA, drowned a tyrant, reshaped a community, and built an empire that will stand long after their names are forgotten, leaving only the legend of the man who owned the lake and made the trespassers pay?